Simone de Beauvoir was not born independent. She became independent, in a world where most women were condemned to repeat their mothers' lives. What is surprising is that from a very young age she broke the norm, studying philosophy at the Sorbonne University, something almost unthinkable for a woman in the 1920s. She was not content with being an outstanding student, but decided to occupy the same intellectual space reserved for men, and she did so with a determination that left many bewildered. Her independence was not an aesthetic gesture, it was a radical choice. Every decision she made was infused with a desire to be the author of her own life, in a time when obedience was the rule. That initial rebellion became one of her most powerful weapons. What makes her story fascinating is how she turned that independence into a kind of personal signature. For example, while many women of her time depended economically on a husband, Simone insisted on supporting herself. She worked as a philosophy teacher and later established herself as a writer, avoiding being chained to the conventions of marriage. This did not mean she rejected love, but she did refuse to live it under imposed contracts. It is as if, from her youth, she understood that independence was more than a privilege. It was an act of survival in a world that denied female autonomy. That decision would shape everything that followed, including her relationship with one of the most influential philosophers of the century, Jean-Paul Sartre. The relationship between Simone and Sartre is a true enigma. They did not live like a traditional marriage, but rather as intellectual partners, with an unusual pact, to be together but without ties. They called it a necessary love combined with contingent loves, a formula that to many seemed scandalous. What is peculiar is that instead of hiding such dynamics, Simone publicly acknowledged them, defying a society sustained by appearances. That bond did not diminish her independence. On the contrary, it reinforced it. Sartre was important, but he was never her owner. She herself described him as someone with whom she shared thought and adventure, but she never defined herself in relation to him. That radical difference still intrigues those trying to understand how one can love without submitting. Beyond her personal life, what made her unforgettable was her ability to channel that independence into writing. With her most famous book, published in 1949, she unleashed a cultural revolution. In those pages, she posed something that seemed unthinkable in her time: that female oppression was not a natural consequence, but a social construction. She dared to say that one is not born a woman, but becomes one. A forceful phrase that still resonates in today's feminist movements. The impact was not only in the content, but also in the way she expressed it, with total intellectual freedom. Simone did not seek to please or soften. She wrote with the rawness of someone who had learned to live outside traditional molds. Her independence became discourse. The impact of that book was so powerful that it crossed borders like a blaze hard to contain. She was criticized, censored, and adored at the same time. Her voice became uncomfortable for politicians, religious figures, and even certain intellectuals who resisted questioning the balance of power. What is impressive is that, despite the hostility, she never recanted. Her independence allowed her to bear the weight of public rejection. She did not seek to please, she sought to expose. And that radical attitude, in a context where female criticism was made invisible, is what established her as a figure almost impossible to ignore. Simone not only made it clear that women had the right to decide their destiny, but she embodied that possibility as few in her time could. A curious fact is that, unlike many women writers of her time, Simone did not lock herself away in an ivory intellectual tower. She traveled, explored, and actively participated in political causes, from anti-colonialism to the defense of civil rights. Her independence also manifested in her commitment to social movements. Just as in her personal life, she did not accept closed categories, she moved in forbidden terrains, questioning both colonial and gender oppression. In Algeria, for example, she denounced the abuses of French colonialism at a time when it was more convenient to remain silent. She never kept quiet. Her voice was uncomfortable, strong, and feared, but also necessary. That coherence between thought and action made her independence shine even more brightly. What is most intriguing is how she combined her passion for freedom with relentless discipline. She wrote every day without rest, as if she knew her life was too short to settle for what was established. She did not simply seek to publish, she sought to transform. That constant habit reveals that her independence was not improvised. It was the result of an iron will. Every page written was an act of resistance, a way of reaffirming that she would not be silenced. Unlike those who confuse freedom with disorder, Simone understood that true independence required structure. That mix of rebellion and discipline is one of the secrets that explain why her legacy remains alive decades later, as if she had never stopped speaking to the present. One element that often goes unnoticed is the way she became a cultural icon without seeking to be one. She did not participate in fashion programs, nor imagine herself as a celebrity, but little by little her face began to appear in magazines, interviews, and photographs that today circulate as historical references. It was her independence that made her magnetic, almost impossible to ignore. Among intellectuals and students, her figure represented an alternative to the planned and domesticated life that society imposed. She was living proof that another way of living was possible, that magnetism was no coincidence. It was the result of years of coherence between thought and action, of having cultivated an identity as singular as a fingerprint in a uniform ocean. Her independence was also reflected in something intimate, her conception of time. While many organized their lives according to social expectations, Simone gave time an almost sacred value, dedicated to intellectual work and experiences lived on her own terms. That decision gave her an impressive creative longevity. She spent decades producing essays, novels, and memoirs, building a personal archive that is now studied in detail at universities around the world. We could say that she saw time as a resource she could not give away, because giving it away meant surrendering freedom. That vision explains why she never fit into marital routines or the temptations of bourgeois comfort. Being independent, for her, was also protecting every minute of her existence. One of the most striking curiosities of her life is her relationship with late fame. Although she was already known in intellectual circles, it was in the 1960s that her figure exploded internationally, thanks to the massive distribution of her books. What is most impressive is that fame did not divert her from her course. It did not turn her into a complacent figure. She remained just as critical, just as uncomfortable. She even used that visibility to amplify delicate political causes, such as the right to abortion, at a time when talking about it was scandalous. She turned that notoriety into a megaphone of independence, showing millions of women that they could question their own destiny. Instead of settling into success, she used it as another tool of resistance. What is fascinating is how she understood education as a weapon. From her early years as a teacher, she often insisted that teaching philosophy was not about transmitting rules, but about awakening questions. Her independence was reflected in her way of teaching, because she did not want obedient students. She wanted critical individuals. She used to say that thinking for oneself was the most radical of freedoms. That approach caused discomfort in institutions that sought uniformity. But she did not care. What is interesting is that, decades later, her pedagogical ideas are still a reference for those who believe that education should not domesticate, but liberate. Her own life was a reflection of that principle. She never accepted being domesticated, nor did she want to domesticate others. Independence was both her personal cause and her method of teaching. When analyzing her memoirs, we discover details that show how deeply her independence was woven into every aspect of her life. She recounts encounters, travels, and loves without fear of scandal, giving space to what others would hide. Publicly confessing emotional adventures and contradictions was a gesture that broke all expectations of femininity in her time. But what is surprising is how she narrated those events without dramatizing, with the naturalness of someone who refuses to apologize for living by her own rules. There lies one of the most magnetic traits of her figure. She never tried to dress up her decisions. Even if they were not always politically correct, she exposed them with brutal honesty. That intellectual nakedness is part of the enigma of her independence, and perhaps the reason for her continued relevance. In her old age, far from softening her positions, Simone maintained her defiant spirit. Even when her health began to deteriorate, she continued writing, giving her opinions, and participating in public debates. Independence was not for her a fleeting youthful impulse, but a vital practice until the end of her days. In the eyes of many, that consistency seemed unbreakable, almost obsessive. But the key was precisely there. She had trained her entire life to live true to her principles. Neither age nor illness managed to take away that autonomy she had defended since youth. It is difficult to find such a consistent example in history. Her trajectory shows that independence was not an accessory gesture. It was the very core of her existence, the force that sustained everything else. If anything is clear, it is that Simone de Beauvoir's independence functioned as a provocative mirror. Those who approached her figure encountered uncomfortable questions. How much of my life is really mine? How much do I accept out of habit? That ability to confront even those who admired her is what makes her such a captivating mystery. It is striking to think that decades after her death, she continues to inspire protests, debates, and reflections worldwide. Her independence was so radical, so authentic, that it ended up becoming immortal. And we are not speaking of immortality in statues or monuments, but in the uncomfortable persistence of her ideas. Because every time someone questions what seemed indisputable, somehow Simone de Beauvoir speaks again.